Surely you think you know the truth about the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The headlines, the documentaries, the footage of that horrific day have all been burned into our collective memory. But what if I told you that everything you've ever heard about that day in Dallas was a carefully crafted lie? What if I told you the real reason Kennedy died wasn't because of a lone gunman perched in a book depository, but because of something far darker, something that only a few of us knew? I should know. I was there. I saw it all unfold with my own eyes. My name is Clint Hill, and for years, I served as the president's most trusted bodyguard. But what you probably don't know is that I wasn't just there to protect him from bullets. My job was to protect him from the kind of truth that could topple governments, destroy alliances, and send shockwaves through the very fabric of society. It's a truth that I've kept hidden for decades, buried deep under layers of secrecy and fear. But now, in the twilight of my life, with nothing left to lose, I'm ready to tell the world why John F. Kennedy was silenced. November 22, 1963, wasn't just the day the president was murdered. It was the day a monumental decision was made. A decision to erase a man who had gotten too close to exposing secrets that no one in power wanted to see the light of day. You might ask yourself, what secrets? The kind that could change everything. But I need you to understand, this isn't some conspiracy theory woven together by fringe thinkers. I was the man standing between Kennedy and the forces that conspired to kill him. I was the man who watched as those forces closed in, slowly, methodically, until there was nothing left to do but watch the inevitable happen. For years, I have remained silent out of fear for my family and my own life. But now, after all these years, I can no longer live with the burden of knowing what really happened. What Kennedy was about to reveal could have altered the course of history, and there were people, powerful people, who would stop at nothing to make sure that truth never saw the light of day. So I ask you, as you read this, do you really believe the story you've been told? Or are you willing to hear the real story, the one I've carried with me for all these years? Because if you are, I will take you back to the moment it all began, when a president dared to challenge the invisible forces shaping our world. I will take you back to the secrets that led to his death and why I was forced to remain silent for so long. John F. Kennedy knew too much, and now it's time you know the truth. I was never supposed to be more than just another face in the crowd, another man in a dark suit blending into the background, standing just out of sight. When I joined the Secret Service, that was all I ever wanted, to do my job, protect the people I was assigned to, and go home at the end of the day. I wasn't looking for power, fame, or recognition. But fate has a way of throwing you into the middle of things, and before I knew it, I was closer to the President of the United States than anyone else in his life, closer than his advisors, closer even than his own family. It was the spring of 1960 when I first met John F. Kennedy. He was still a senator then, a man with ambition in his eyes and a vision for a future that, even then, felt impossible. My job was simple: protect Jacqueline Kennedy. But as the weeks turned into months and Kennedy's campaign gained steam, I found myself becoming more than just a bodyguard. I was his shadow, his confidant, the man he could trust when the cameras weren't rolling, when the doors were closed, and when the real decisions were being made. There's something about standing guard over someone day after day, seeing them at their most vulnerable, that makes you see things you weren't meant to. I saw the exhaustion in Kennedy's eyes, the toll the presidency was taking on him before he had even won it. But I also saw something else. a determination, a fire that set him apart from the others in Washington. He wasn't just another politician. He wanted to change things, to break the system that had kept so many in the dark for so long. And that scared a lot of people. When he won the election in 1961, my job got more complicated. I wasn't just assigned to guard his wife anymore. Now I was part of his inner circle, the one who stood by his side during those quiet moments when he let his guard down. He trusted me in a way that few ever did. And with that trust came a burden I never expected to carry. It was during those first few months in the White House that I began to notice things. Subtle at first, but impossible to ignore as time went on. Late-night meetings with men whose faces I didn't recognize. Phone calls in the middle of the night, after which Kennedy would pace his office, muttering to himself. His mood swings became more frequent, his once unshakable confidence wavering. It wasn't until one particular night in April that I began to understand what was happening. I was stationed outside the Oval Office as I had been so many nights before. The halls were quiet, and most of the staff had long since gone home. Suddenly, I heard the president's voice, but it wasn't the calm, controlled tone I was used to. It was frantic, almost terrified. "I can't do this," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "They won't let me." I froze. I'd never heard him like this before. For a moment, I thought about knocking on the door, asking if he was all right. But something held me back. Some instinct telling me that this was a conversation I wasn't supposed to overhear. That night marked the beginning of a shift, one that I couldn't fully comprehend at the time. Kennedy started pulling away from his advisors, from his closest friends, even from his wife, but not from me. If anything, he relied on me more than ever. He trusted me because I wasn't part of the machine. I wasn't a politician or a strategist. I was just the man who stood guard, and maybe that made me the only one he felt he could be honest with. As the months passed, I watched as Kennedy began to unravel. The meetings grew more frequent, the visitors more secretive. He spoke in code sometimes, referencing things I didn't understand, things that weren't meant for people like me. And yet, there was a look in his eyes, a look of fear, of knowing too much. It was the look of a man who was in way over his head, but who couldn't turn back. I never asked him what was going on. Maybe I was too afraid of the answer. But one thing was becoming clear. John F. Kennedy was no longer just the man who wanted to change the country. He was a man who had discovered something so big, so dangerous, that it was beginning to consume him. And in those moments, when he looked at me with that haunted expression, I knew that whatever it was going to get him killed. At the time, I didn't fully understand the gravity of what I was seeing. I was just a bodyguard, after all, trained to keep my mouth shut and my eyes forward. But deep down, I knew. I knew that whatever Kennedy was dealing with, it was something far beyond politics, far beyond the office he held. It was something darker, something that had already started to tear him apart from the inside. And it was only a matter of time before it tore the rest of us apart, too. It was just past midnight on a Friday in early June when everything began to unravel. The White House had long since quieted down for the night, the soft glow of the moon casting shadows over the manicured lawns. I was stationed outside the Oval Office, like always, standing in the stillness of the night, watching over the president as he worked late into the hours. Nothing about the night seemed out of the ordinary until I heard the knock. It wasn't a heavy knock like the kind you'd expect from a dignitary or a military official. It was soft, deliberate, like whoever was on the other side wanted to make sure no one else heard it. I tensed up immediately. No one had an appointment with the president at that hour. He was supposed to be alone, reviewing speeches and preparing for meetings with his staff the next morning. But before I could react, the door opened a crack, and a man I had never seen before stepped into the room. He was tall, wearing a dark suit that blended into the shadows of the room. His face was angular, his eyes sharp and calculating. Something about him felt wrong, out of place. I reached for the door handle, ready to step in, but Kennedy's voice stopped me. "It's fine, Clint," he called out, his tone calm but with an undercurrent of tension. "We won't be long." Reluctantly, I stepped back, but my hand hovered over my sidearm. Something told me I should be ready. The man closed the door behind him, and for the next hour, the Oval Office remained shrouded in silence. I strained my ears, hoping to catch even the faintest sound of their conversation. But all I heard was the occasional low murmur, too quiet to make out the words. When the door finally opened again, the stranger walked out without so much as a glance in my direction. He moved quickly, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his lips pressed into a thin line. There was a coldness about him, a feeling that left the air thick and suffocating in his wake. I watched him disappear down the hallway, a knot tightening in my stomach. I stepped inside the Oval Office, half expecting to find the president in some state of distress, but what I saw was even worse. Kennedy sat behind his desk, hands folded in front of him, staring blankly at a stack of papers. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a heaviness that seemed to settle over his entire body. He didn't look up when I approached. "Who was that?" I asked quietly, my voice breaking the silence. For a moment he didn't answer. He just sat there, unmoving, like he hadn't even heard the question. Then, slowly, he lifted his head, his eyes meeting mine with a look I had never seen before. It was fear, pure and unfiltered. "It's nothing you need to worry about, Clint," he said softly, almost too softly. "Go home. Get some rest." I wanted to push, to ask more, but something in his voice told me it wasn't the time. So I left, though the image of his haunted expression stayed with me long after I'd walked out the door. In the weeks that followed, the late-night visits became more frequent. The same man returned, sometimes alone, sometimes with others, men in dark suits, with faces I couldn't place, and accents I didn't recognize. They came and went under the cover of night, slipping in and out of the Oval Office like ghosts, leaving behind nothing but an increasing sense of dread that gnawed at my insides. Kennedy grew more distant with each passing day. His once warm demeanor had been replaced by something colder, harder. He started making decisions without consulting his closest advisors, holding meetings behind closed doors with men who, like the first stranger, didn't belong. The staff noticed it too, the way the president seemed to be withdrawing into himself, but no one dared to ask what was really going on. It wasn't until one night in late July that I finally got a glimpse of the truth. The president had just finished a late meeting with a group of foreign dignitaries, ambassadors from Russia, China, Germany, and North Korea, if I remember correctly. As usual, I was posted outside, waiting for the meeting to end so I could escort the dignitaries back to their cars. But when the door opened and the ambassadors stepped out, their faces were pale, their expressions grim. They exchanged no pleasantries, no goodbyes. They simply left, like men fleeing from a disaster they couldn't stop. I stepped into the Oval Office once the room was empty and Kennedy was still at his desk, his hand clutching a pen so tightly his knuckles were white. His face was gaunt, and his eyes were sunken as if he hadn't slept in days. "What a peanut in there?" I asked, the words escaping me before I could stop them. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a deep sigh, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples like a man carrying the weight of the world. "They don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "None of them do. But I'm going to tell them, Clint. I'm going to tell the world." "Tell them what?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. Kennedy looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and fear. "The truth," he said, "about what's really out there, about the forces controlling everything we think we know." I stood there frozen, my mind struggling to comprehend what he was saying. "You can't do that," I said finally, my voice trembling. "They'll kill you." For the first time in weeks, Kennedy smiled, but it wasn't a smile of reassurance. It was a sad, knowing smile. "Maybe," he said, "but I can't keep this to myself anymore. The world deserves to know." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a lead blanket. I wanted to argue, to convince him to let it go, to protect himself, but I knew it was futile. He had made up his mind, and there was no turning back. That night, as I left the White House, the fear I had been trying to suppress for months finally broke through. Kennedy was playing a dangerous game, one that I wasn't sure either of us would survive. And deep down, I knew the forces he was talking about weren't going to let him walk away unscathed. The president was about to make enemies far more dangerous than any he had ever faced, and I was powerless to stop it. All I could do was stand by his side, watching as the shadows closed in, inch by inch, until there was nowhere left to hide. By the time August rolled around, the tension in the White House had become unbearable. Everyone felt it. The staff, the Secret Service, even the press corps that lingered outside. The air was thick with a kind of anxiety that clung to you like the moment before a storm hits. It was more than just the usual political stress. There was something darker at play, something hidden just beneath the surface, and I was the only one close enough to Kennedy to see it unraveling in real time. The late-night meetings continued, but they were different now. It wasn't just the occasional foreign diplomat slipping in and out of the Oval Office anymore. Now the visitors came in small groups, always in the dead of night, and always with the same hollow-eyed look of men who knew too much. The president was holding court with people who didn't belong anywhere near Washington, let alone the most powerful office in the world. One night, after hours of sitting outside the office, I saw something I wish I hadn't. The door opened, and 3 figures stepped out. They weren't diplomats or military officials. They weren't even men, not in the way I understood. They were tall, much taller than anyone I'd ever seen, their skin a strange, pale blue hue that seemed to shimmer in the dim hallway light. Their eyes, large and reflective, gave off an unnatural glow like they could see straight through you. I froze, unsure of whether I was still awake or trapped in some feverish nightmare. But it was real. They were real. They moved silently, their steps soundless, and for a moment, one of them turned its head slightly toward me. No words were exchanged, but I felt something, a pressure in my mind, like someone or something was pushing against my thoughts, testing them. And then, as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone, vanishing into the shadows as if they had never existed at all. My heart raced, and I forced myself to take a deep breath before stepping into the Oval Office. Kennedy was sitting behind his desk, as he always did after these meetings, but he wasn't the same man I had known for years. He looked older, more tired, like something had been slowly draining the life out of him. His hands were clasped together, his eyes fixed on the surface of his desk, as if he was deep in thought, or maybe deep in something much worse. "Mr. President," I said cautiously, unsure of how to even begin. What? Who were they? For a long time, Kennedy didn't respond. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. And then, without lifting his gaze, he said, "They're called Syrians. They've been watching us for longer than you can imagine." The words hung in the air, and I could feel my stomach drop. Syrians. The word felt foreign, strange, like something out of a science fiction novel. But this was no story. This was real, and the president was telling me something that I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. "They came to me months ago," Kennedy continued, his voice quiet, almost resigned. "They wanted to make contact. They told me they've been monitoring humanity, watching our progress, our wars, our failures. They offered assistance, technology, knowledge. But they also warned me. They said there are forces on this planet, powerful forces, who will stop at nothing to keep their influence over the world." I struggled to process what I was hearing. This wasn't some abstract political issue. This was something far more terrifying, far more dangerous than I could have imagined. "Why you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why come to you?" Kennedy leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as if the weight of the universe was pressing down on him. "Because I was willing to listen," he said. "They knew I wanted change, real change, and they knew I'd be willing to risk everything to make it happen." I stood there, the reality of what he was saying sinking in. Aliens, secret societies, global conspiracies. It all sounded too far-fetched, too unbelievable. But the look in Kennedy's eyes told me everything I needed to know. He believed it. He believed every word. "They want to help humanity," he went on, "to push us into the next phase of our evolution. But the problem is, the people who run this world don't want that. They're too comfortable with things the way they are. They don't want change. They don't want progress." He paused, his gaze shifting toward the window as if he could see something far beyond the White House lawn, far beyond the world we thought we knew. "They told me I had to be careful, that if I tried to go public with this, there would be consequences. But I can't stay silent, Clint. I won't." The pit in my stomach deepened. I knew what he was saying was dangerous. I knew that if he tried to tell the world about this, it wouldn't end well. "Sir," I said cautiously, "you're talking about something that could get you killed." Kennedy nodded slowly, his expression grim. "I know," he said softly, "but what choice do I have? The people deserve to know the truth. They deserve to know that we're not alone, and that the powers controlling this world aren't who they think they are." I wanted to argue, to convince him to drop it, to let this go before it consumed him completely. But deep down, I knew it was pointless. Kennedy had made up his mind. He was going to expose the truth, no matter the cost. That night, as I left the Oval Office, the weight of what I'd learned sat heavy on my shoulders. I wasn't sure what scared me more. The fact that extraterrestrial beings had been meeting with the president in secret, or the fact that powerful people in positions of influence and authority, were willing to kill to keep that information buried. From that moment on, I knew I was no longer just protecting the president from the dangers of this world. I was protecting him from forces beyond it, forces that were already circling, waiting for the moment to strike. And I knew deep down that time was running out. As the summer dragged on, the weight of the secret Kennedy carried seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. The late-night meetings with the Syrians became more frequent, their presence more unnerving each time. They came and went like shadows, slipping in and out of the Oval Office without a sound, leaving behind an air of mystery and dread. Every time they left, the president seemed more distant, more consumed by whatever knowledge they were feeding him. But it wasn't just the Syrians that concerned me anymore. I started noticing subtle changes in the people around us, his advisors, the security personnel, even members of Congress. There was a quietness to them, a strange undercurrent of tension whenever Kennedy was mentioned. It was like they all knew something they weren't willing to talk about, but couldn't completely hide. Then one evening in early September, Kennedy called me into his office. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room. I had grown used to these late-night summons, but this one felt different. There was a gravity in his voice, a seriousness that made my skin prickle. "Clint," he began as I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me, "I've made a decision." He gestured for me to sit, but I remained standing, my hands clasped behind my back. I knew better than to relax when he used that tone. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, his eyes locking onto mine, and for a moment, I saw the old John F. Kennedy, the fearless leader who had once inspired hope in an entire nation. But now, there was something else in his gaze. Determination, yes, but also fear. "I'm going to do it," he said, his voice steady but tinged with resignation. "I'm going to tell the world." My heart skipped a beat. I knew exactly what he meant. He had been hinting at this for weeks now, ever since the Syrians had first approached him with their warnings about the hidden forces controlling humanity. But to hear him say it so plainly, so definitively, sent a chill down my spine. "Sir," I began, my voice careful, measured, "you know what that means. You know what will happen if you go public with this." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "I know the risks, Clint, but I also know what's at stake. The people deserve to know the truth. They deserve to know that we're not alone, that there are powers controlling their lives without them even realizing it." I took a step closer to his desk, lowering my voice. "They'll kill you." Kennedy didn't flinch. He just stared at me, his eyes hard, unyielding. "Maybe," he admitted, "but I can't stay silent. I won't let them keep humanity in the dark any longer." A long silence settled over the room. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning, the distant murmur of the city outside. But inside the Oval Office, it felt like time had stopped. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was making a mistake, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Kennedy was a man who had made up his mind, and nothing I said would change it. "When?" I asked finally, my voice barely a whisper. "Soon," he replied, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the desk. "I'm preparing a statement. I'm going to announce it in a few weeks. Once the press is in place, I'll tell them everything about the Syrians, about the secret societies, about the forces that have been manipulating world events for decades." I felt my stomach turn. This was it. This was the moment everything would come crashing down. I could see it playing out in my mind, the press conference, the gasps of disbelief from the reporters, the backlash from the political elite, the assassination attempts that would follow. I knew it was only a matter of time before they got to him. But what terrified me more than anything was the certainty in his voice. He knew exactly what was coming, and he wasn't backing down. "I need you with me, Clint," he said suddenly, pulling me out of my thoughts. His voice softened, almost pleading. "You've been by my side through all of this. You've seen what I've seen. You're the only one I trust." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Could I really stand by him, knowing what was coming? Could I really protect him from forces that went far beyond bullets and political intrigue? But I had made a vow years ago to protect the man no matter the cost. And now, as the reality of what was about to happen settled over me, I knew I couldn't walk away. "I'm with you, sir," I said finally, my voice steady but hollow. Kennedy smiled, but it was a sad smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. He nodded, then leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I knew I could count on you." The days that followed were a blur of preparations. Kennedy met with his speechwriters, his advisors, and a handful of trusted aides, carefully crafting the message he would deliver to the world. But the more public-facing meetings he had, the more shadows seemed to gather around him. I noticed figures in the halls I didn't recognize, men who didn't belong. They watched him, and I could feel their eyes on me too, like predators circling prey. One evening, as I made my rounds, I overheard a conversation between two of the staff members in hushed tones. "It's too dangerous," one of them whispered. "He's going to get himself killed." The other one nodded grimly. "It's not just him. They won't stop until anyone who knows is silenced." I felt a cold wave wash over me. This wasn't just about Kennedy anymore. The people behind this, whoever they were, would go after anyone who stood by him, anyone who threatened to expose their plans. And I knew in that moment that I was just as much a target as he was. The night before the press conference, Kennedy called me into his office one last time. He was sitting at his desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring out the window into the darkness. When I entered, he didn't look at me. He just kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if searching for something beyond the world we knew. "I have a feeling, Clint," he said softly, his voice tinged with an almost eerie calm. Tomorrow, everything changes." I stood there silent, unsure of what to say. I had no comforting words, no promises of safety. We both knew what was coming. "I don't regret it," he added, finally turning to face me. "No matter what happens, I don't regret it. The truth is worth it." I nodded, my throat tight. "Yes, sir," I managed to say, though the words felt hollow. As I left his office that night, a sinking feeling settled in my chest. The truth was coming, yes, but so was the reckoning, and there was nothing any of us could do to stop it. The next morning, everything would change, and we both knew it was only a matter of time before the world, and the men who controlled it, decided they couldn't let John F. Kennedy live another day. The morning of November 22, 1963, began like any other. The sun rose over Dallas, casting long golden rays across the city, the air crisp and cool. But I could feel the tension buzzing underneath the surface like the quiet hum of a machine just before it breaks down. It was a tension I had become all too familiar with in the months leading up to this day, a sense that something monumental, something irreversible was about to happen. Kennedy was in good spirits, or at least he appeared to be. He always had a way of masking his fears, even when I knew the weight of the world was crushing him from all sides. We'd gone over the schedule the night before, meticulously planning each step, each stop. The motorcade route through Dealey Plaza was supposed to be a routine trip. Greet the crowds, wave from the convertible, and make our way to the luncheon where he'd be delivering a speech. Simple, safe. But deep down, I knew better. As the morning wore on, my unease grew. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking straight into a trap, though I had no concrete evidence to back it up. It was just a gut instinct, the same one that had saved my life more times than I could count during my years in the Secret Service. The problem was, there was no way to stop it, no way to change the course of what was already in motion. The crowds were larger than expected, Thousands of people lining the streets, waving American flags, holding signs of support. I kept my eyes on the rooftops, scanning the windows, looking for anything that seemed out of place. But it was impossible to see everything, to protect against every angle. The convertible rolled slowly through the streets, the President and Mrs. Kennedy smiling and waving, the people cheering. And all I could do was sit in the follow-up car a few paces behind, my heart pounding in my chest. As we neared Dealey Plaza, something shifted. The air felt thicker, heavier. My senses were on high alert, and every sound, every movement seemed amplified. I caught a glimpse of Kennedy as he turned to wave to the crowd, his face bright with that unmistakable charm. But then he looked forward, and for just a split second, I saw something in his eyes, a flicker of realization, or maybe it was fear. It was as if in that brief moment, he knew what was about to happen. And then it did. The first shot rang out, a sharp crack that echoed off the buildings. My hand instinctively went to my sidearm, my eyes darting across the plaza, trying to locate the source. Before I could react, a second shot, louder this time, more final, tore through the air. I watched in horror as the President's body jerked forward, his head snapping back with a force that made my stomach turn. Blood sprayed across the car, staining the crisp white of Mrs. Kennedy's suit. Time slowed down. Everything became a blur of chaos and screams, the crowd surging forward in panic. I leapt from the car, running toward the convertible, my heart pounding in my ears. Secret Service agents swarmed around me, shouting orders, but none of it registered. All I could see was Kennedy slumped over, his lifeless body cradled in Jackie's arms, her face frozen in shock and horror. I reached the car just as another agent pulled Jackie back, her hands covered in blood, still reaching for her husband as if she could somehow pull him back from the abyss. But it was too late. I knew it the moment I saw him, the moment I looked into his eyes. John F. Kennedy was gone. The next few minutes were a whirlwind of movement. Agents shouting into their radios, ordering the motorcade to the hospital, people running, screaming. But for me, everything faded into the background. I stood there frozen, my hands gripping the side of the car, staring at the man I had sworn to protect, the man who had trusted me with his life, and I had failed him. As the car sped away, heading for Parkland Memorial Hospital, I climbed into the follow-up car, my mind racing. It wasn't just the horror of the moment, the blood, the chaos. It was the knowledge of what had really happened, of why Kennedy had been killed. This wasn't just the act of a lone madman. This wasn't just another political assassination. This was something far darker, something orchestrated by forces that had been watching us for months. I replayed the conversations we had in the Oval Office, the warnings from the Syrians, the late-night meetings with men who held more power than any politician or president ever could. I remembered the moment Kennedy had told me he was going to reveal the truth, that he couldn't stay silent any longer. He had known the risks. We both had. But in the end, it didn't matter. The truth was too dangerous, too earth-shattering, and they had silenced him before he could speak it. The car screeched to a halt outside the hospital, and I jumped out, following the other agents as they rushed Kennedy inside. Doctors and nurses swarmed around him, their faces grim, but I already knew it was over. There was no saving him. I stood outside the trauma room, listening to the sounds of desperate attempts to revive a man who had been dead the moment that bullet hit him. Time moved strangely in those hours after the assassination. Every minute felt like a lifetime. I found myself pacing the halls, my mind racing, trying to piece together what had just happened. I knew there would be an official story, a narrative that would be sold to the public. They would blame it on a lone gunman, a man named Lee Harvey Oswald, a convenient scapegoat who had been waiting in the wings all along. But I knew the truth. I knew that Oswald was just a pawn, just one piece of a much larger, darker plan. The real killers were still out there, hidden in the shadows, pulling the strings. They had been watching Kennedy from the moment he decided to speak out, and they had struck when he least expected it. I knew because I had seen them. I had felt their presence, their cold eyes watching us as we moved through the streets of Dallas. And now, they were gone, leaving behind only questions, only a shattered world. Hours later, when the news officially broke that John F. Kennedy was dead, the nation wept. The world wept. But behind closed doors, I knew there were men who were relieved, men who had been waiting for this moment. They had won. They had silenced him. And now they were coming for the rest of us. In the days that followed, I tried to process the enormity of what had happened. I wanted to scream, to tell the world what I knew, to expose the conspiracy that had taken the life of a man who only wanted to make the world a better place. But I couldn't. Not yet. The forces at play were too powerful, too dangerous. I had to bide my time, had to stay silent, just as they wanted. But I knew one day the truth would come out. One day the world would know why John F. Kennedy was silenced and who had really pulled the trigger. The days that followed Kennedy's assassination passed in a haze of grief and disbelief. The world was in shock, mourning the loss of a leader who had been so full of life, so determined to change the course of history. But behind the public outpouring of sorrow, behind the black and white footage of the funeral procession, there was a different kind of silence. It was the kind that weighed heavy, like a thick fog that dulled the senses and made it hard to breathe. I felt that silence everywhere I went, in every corner of the White House, in every conversation with the remaining staff. It was the silence of a truth no one could speak. I stayed in Washington for the next few weeks, doing my job as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. I kept my head down, avoiding the reporters and the questions, avoiding the knowing glances from people who had their own suspicions about what had really happened. The official story had already taken shape. The Warren Commission had begun its investigation, and the narrative of a lone gunman acting on his own was being cemented in the minds of the public. But I knew better. I had seen the fear in Kennedy's eyes, the weight of the decision he had made to go public with what he knew. And now, the man who had trusted me with that secret was dead, and I was left holding the pieces of a story that no one wanted to hear. I tried to convince myself that it was safer this way, that staying silent would protect the people I cared about. But deep down, I knew I wasn't protecting anyone. I was just buying time. One evening, about a month after the assassination, I received an unexpected visitor. I was alone in my small apartment, nursing a drink, trying to drown out the images that kept replaying in my mind. Kennedy's body slumped over in the car, the blood, the screams, the shock on Jackie's face. There was a knock at the door, soft but deliberate, the kind of knock that made my heart race. I opened the door to find a man I had never seen before standing on the other side. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit that seemed to blend into the shadows of the hallway. His face was sharp, his eyes cold and emotionless. I didn't have to ask who he was. I knew just by looking at him that he was one of them, one of the men who had been watching us, who had orchestrated this entire thing from the beginning. "We need to talk," he said in a voice that was low and calm, like he was discussing the weather. I didn't respond, just stepped aside and let him in. There was no point in resisting. These men had power, real power, and I wasn't in a position to fight them. He walked into my living room, taking in his surroundings with a quick glance before turning back to face me. "You know too much," he said, without preamble. His tone was matter-of-fact, as if we were discussing something inevitable, something predetermined. "And that makes you a liability." I felt a chill run down my spine. I had been expecting this, of course. Ever since Kennedy's death, I had known they would come for me eventually. But hearing it spoken aloud, so plainly, still sent a shock of fear through my body. "I haven't told anyone," I said, my voice steady despite the knot of fear tightening in my chest. "I've kept my mouth shut, just like you wanted." The man nodded, his expression unchanging. "For now, but we both know that secrets have a way of getting out, don't they? And we can't afford any loose ends." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. "So, what now? You're here to silence me too?" He smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind that made your blood run cold. "That depends on you, Clint. We don't need to take drastic measures yet. But you need to understand something. You need to understand that this isn't just about you. If you talk, if you even think about revealing what you know, it won't be just you who suffers." He let the words hang in the air, and I knew what he meant. My family, my friends, anyone I had ever been close to, they would all be at risk. These men didn't operate within the bounds of morality or law. They didn't care about the innocent lives they destroyed, as long as their secrets stayed buried. "I understand," I said quietly, my mind racing. I knew there was no way out of this. They had me trapped, and I had no choice but to play along, to keep my mouth shut, and hope that, by some miracle, I could outlast them. The man nodded, satisfied with my answer. "Good. You'll continue living your life as you have, quietly, out of the spotlight, and in return, we'll let you live it. But make no mistake, one wrong move, and we'll be back, and next time, there won't be a conversation." He turned to leave, but paused at the door, glancing back at me one last time. "This is bigger than you, Clint. Bigger than Kennedy, even. You're lucky you've made it this far." And with that, he was gone, leaving me standing there alone in the quiet of my apartment, my hands shaking. From that moment on, my life changed. I went back to work, but nothing felt the same. I kept my distance from everyone, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. I couldn't risk anyone getting too close. Couldn't risk anyone asking the wrong questions. The weight of the truth bore down on me like a vice, and there were nights when I barely slept, haunted by the knowledge of what I knew, by the memories of what I had seen. The public moved on, of course. The narrative had been set. Oswald was painted as the deranged assassin, a loner who had acted out of some misguided political conviction. The media ran with it, and soon enough, people stopped asking questions. They accepted the official story, and the world went back to normal, or as close to normal as it could get. But I couldn't move on. I couldn't forget. The truth clung to me like a shadow, always there, always reminding me of the cost of silence. I wanted to scream, to shout it from the rooftops, to let the world know what had really happened. But every time I thought about it, I saw the faces of my family, my friends, the people I cared about, and I knew I couldn't risk it. So, I stayed quiet. I lived my life in the margins, a shadow of the man I used to be. The years passed, and with each one, the weight of the secret grew heavier, until it felt like it might crush me completely. But I never spoke a word. I never told anyone what I had seen, what I knew, because they were still watching, and I knew that as long as they were, I would never be free. And so, the truth stayed buried, just as they wanted it to, for now. But one day, I knew it would come out. One day, the world would learn what I had been forced to keep hidden. The truth has a way of doing that, no matter how deep you bury it. But by then, it would be too late. It's strange how time erases the edges of things, smoothing out the sharp moments that once cut so deep. As the years passed, the weight of Kennedy's death began to settle into the pages of history books, becoming another event in a long list of American tragedies. The public moved on, as they always do. New presidents came and went, scandals and wars filled the headlines, and the memory of that fateful day in Dallas faded into the background, dulled by the passage of time. But for me, it never faded. The images of that day were seared into my mind, as fresh now as they were the moment it all happened. I lived in the shadows after that. The once busy halls of the White House were replaced by the quiet solitude of my own existence. I left the Secret Service shortly after the assassination. I told people it was to spend more time with my family. But the truth was, I couldn't bear to be there any longer. Everywhere I went, I saw ghosts. Kennedy's smile, his laugh, the way he'd look at me with that twinkle in his eye when he thought he had outsmarted someone in the room. It was too much. So I left. But leaving the job didn't mean leaving the secret. That was something I couldn't escape no matter how far I tried to run. I spent years trying to drown it in bottles of whiskey, losing myself in the haze of alcohol and regret. But it never worked. The truth was always there, lurking in the corners of my mind, whispering to me in the dead of night when sleep refused to come. I tried to forget. I tried to push it down, bury it beneath the surface, but the truth has a way of clawing its way back up, no matter how hard you try to suppress it. And so, as the years went by, I found myself living in a kind of half-life, always looking over my shoulder, always wondering if today would be the day they finally came for me. The men who had orchestrated Kennedy's death, the ones who had come to my apartment that night, they never truly went away. Their presence was always felt, even if they weren't physically there. I knew they were still watching, still waiting, making sure I stayed in line. And I did. I played the part they wanted me to play. The quiet, loyal former bodyguard who didn't ask questions, who didn't stir the pot. I kept my head down, lived a life of quiet desperation, and pretended that everything was fine. But I wasn't fine. How could I be? I had been there, right beside a man who had tried to change the world, and I had watched as the world tore him apart for it. I had stood by, helpless, as the very people Kennedy had tried to expose conspired to end his life. And I had kept their secret out of fear, out of necessity, out of self-preservation. As the years stretched into decades, I began to realize something. The men who had silenced Kennedy, the ones who had orchestrated his death, weren't as untouchable as they seemed. They were powerful, yes. They controlled the narrative, manipulated governments, made people disappear. But time, as it turns out, is the great equalizer. The same men who had terrified me in my younger years were now old, frail, just like me. Their power was fading, their influence waning. And with each passing year, the hold they had over me weakened just a little bit more. I'm in my 90s now. My body is failing me, my mind not as sharp as it once was. But one thing has remained crystal clear: the truth. I've lived with it for far too long, kept it locked away in the deepest parts of myself, terrified of what might happen if it ever saw the light of day. But now, with the end so close, I find I no longer care about the consequences. What can they do to me now? Take away my last few breaths? I've already lived longer than I ever expected to, far longer than most men who know what I know. And so here I am, finally ready to tell the truth. Not for me, I'm too old for redemption, too old to care about clearing my name. No, this is for Kennedy, for the man who trusted me with his life, who confided in me when no one else would listen. This is for the man who tried to change the world and was killed for it. It wasn't the Russians or the Cubans or any of the other convenient scapegoats they paraded in front of the cameras. No, the people responsible for Kennedy's death were the ones who sat in the highest seats of power, hidden behind layers of secrecy and influence. They were men who operated in the shadows, men who had spent decades manipulating world events to suit their own ends. Kennedy was a threat to them, not because of his policies or his speeches, but because he knew the truth. He knew about the secret societies, the extraterrestrial encounters, the forces behind the curtain pulling the strings. And he was ready to tell the world. That was his crime. He dared to pull back the curtain, dared to expose the truth to a public that had been kept in the dark for too long. And for that, they killed him. They silenced him before he could speak. And they've spent the last 60 years controlling the narrative, ensuring that no one ever gets close to uncovering the truth. But the truth has a way of surfacing, even when those in power try to bury it. And now, as I sit here in the twilight of my life, I'm no longer afraid. I've kept this secret for far too long, and it's time the world knew what really happened. It's time they knew why John F. Kennedy was silenced. I know they'll come for me when I tell this story. I know they'll try to stop me, to bury this truth along with me, but I'm not afraid anymore. What do I have left to lose? They took everything from me the day they took Kennedy. My life, my peace, my sense of purpose. All of it died along with him in that car in Dallas. So here it is. The truth they've worked so hard to hide. The truth I've carried with me all these years through the loneliness, the fear, the sleepless nights. John F. Kennedy was killed because he knew too much. He was killed because he was brave enough to stand up to the most powerful forces on this planet, and they couldn't let that happen. And now, as I sit here waiting for whatever comes next, I can finally breathe. The truth is out there now. Let them come. Let them try to silence me. It's too late for them to stop it now. I've carried this burden for far too long. It's time for the world to carry it too.